By the time Henry Bell arrived at the old Marrow estate in the spring of 1902, the garden had already begun swallowing itself. Ivy ran wild along the brick path, curling like green smoke over cracked stone. What once might have been beds of sage and belladonna were now brittle stalks twisted into forgotten patterns. The house stood behind him, long empty, its windows sealed with warped boards and its chimneys crumbling into themselves. His task was simple: rebuild the herb walkway from the edge of the gate to the remnants of the conservatory. He'd done worse work for lesser pay. But nothing in his years of mending gardens had prepared him for what he found beneath the first row of stones. It wasn't the shape that caught him first, but the softness. Stone shouldn't shift under its own weight. Yet when he pressed his boot to the third flagstone near the iris patch, the earth gave a little. Not mud, not decay. Something loose. He crouched and slid his trowel into the side seam. With one pry, the stone lifted too easily, and what lay underneath didn't look right. The soil was light brown and almost fine, like sifted flour, too airy for ground that should have been untouched for decades. He dug gently, more curious than afraid, his gloved fingers scooping just enough to find a corner of something smooth. Porcelain, white, small. He paused, held it in his palm. A baby shoe, not leather, not cloth. Glazed and perfect, shaped like something meant to be displayed on a shelf. But it was scratched. The toe was chipped, and on the side, faint as memory, someone had etched a symbol into the glaze. A circle, interrupted by a single vertical line through its center. Not a maker's mark, something older, more personal. He turned the shoe over and for a moment thought he saw a red stain beneath the heel. But when he looked again, it was gone. The soil below was damp, but not bloody. Still, he put the shoe aside and stood up slower than before. Something in the air had changed. Henry didn't speak of it when he returned to town that evening, but he didn't go back the next day, or the next week. He sent word by letter citing illness. After a month, the Marrow estate trustees hired someone else, a man named Clive, who completed the garden path without noting a single disturbance. Clive never found the shoe, because Henry had taken it home and placed it in a drawer beneath his socks, unsure why he couldn't throw it away. That same year, a small-town newspaper printed a 2-paragraph column about the curious find. A local reporter named Samuel Keene visited Henry's home after catching wind of the story at the tavern. Henry didn't say much, just that he'd found something odd in the soil and it looked like it had been waiting. The article ran once near the obituaries, no follow-up, no response. The estate remained unsold. But Keene never forgot it. Years later, after he'd retired and begun organizing old notes, he found the clipping again, folded neatly into an envelope with Henry's name scrawled in pencil, barely legible. Inside was something stranger still, a sketch of the shoe with a single phrase written beneath it in faded ink. I was meant to stay. The sketch was never published. Keene left it among a pile of unsorted documents that were eventually donated to the county archives. There, it remained, unopened for decades, pressed flat between minutes of forgotten town meetings and grain records from another century. No one disturbed the Marrow Garden after that. The path held firm, the ivy grew back, and beneath the stones the earth stayed quiet, but the shoe had come from somewhere, and somewhere below the rest still waited. It arrived in a sealed box marked only by number, record 1832. No return address, no catalog index. Found at the bottom of a locked storage closet in what was once the Westbrook Asylum. The box was coated in a thin film of chalky dust and wrapped in muslin that smelled faintly of old camphor. Inside were brittle files, water-warped charts, and at the bottom a bound ledger with faded leather covers and delicate handwritten script. Vale, Agatha, private, do not discard. The handwriting was crisp, upright, each line meticulous, the kind of penmanship trained into those who recorded things that were never meant to be shared aloud. The first pages appeared unremarkable, schedules of patient feedings, linen counts, medicinal dosages. But then came the entry from October 3rd, 1831. The tone shifted, the ink darker, the strokes slower. The infant was carried in wrapped with belladonna in the folds. Her eyes were already closed. She did not open them again. There was no patient name, no mother listed, only a note that the child had come from the house at the far wood's edge, Marrow. Agatha Vale had been a nurse for nearly 12 years by then. She had written of autopsies, of seizures, of drownings in the bath basins. But her entries changed after that one. They grew clipped, hesitant. She began to mention the twins in white, who never cried and were only walked at dusk. She wrote of the physician who came monthly with iron teeth and no scent. She wrote of sleepwalking and strange scratches that appeared across her collarbone after night shifts. But most of all, she wrote of the garden. "I was told not to walk it alone," she wrote on November 9th. "There is a second path beneath the green. They said it glows in frost." Another entry days later read, "I heard it again, the scraping beneath stone. It is not rats, it is counting." The garden came up repeatedly, never with fear, but with reverence, as if it were not simply a space behind the estate, but something kept, protected, the kind of place you didn't look at too long. One entry described the sound of crying that seemed to come from beneath her shoes as she fetched water near the herb basin. Another, more chilling, described a moment where the crying stopped the moment she looked up at the old conservatory windows, as if the silence had obeyed something behind the glass. Toward the journal's end, entries became erratic. Dates were repeated or crossed out. Certain lines were blacked out entirely, scratched so hard the paper tore. One final entry remained legible. It read, "I saw her again today, the girl with the stitched jaw. She placed her hands on the rosemary and whispered with no mouth. I felt my tongue move, though I spoke nothing. I believe she is still under there." Then nothing. The journal had been tucked beneath rusted patient records in a box that was never logged in the asylum's final inventory. No one knows who packed it, but someone sent it, wrapped it in fresh muslin, wrote the number carefully, and deposited it through the locked mail slot of the county archive building just before closing. The staff almost discarded it. But one intern, hired fresh out of school and curious about old institutions, kept it aside. She read too far, asked too many questions, and after her second week stopped showing up altogether. Her badge was later found tucked inside a library book on botanical funerary customs. The book was marked open to a page about grave herbs and their meanings. Rosemary for remembrance, rue for repentance, belladonna for silence. The journal remains in the restricted collection, but pages still turn when no one's there. In the faded ink of St. Hallow Parish's birth ledgers, the name Judith Ellsworth appears 13 times across 3 years, always in the margins, never in the body. Not listed under officiants, not formally acknowledged. Just her neat looping signature beside notations that lacked the usual sacramental entries. No baptisms, no parental names. Only the word delivered and a date. Between June 1829 and October 1831, 13 children were recorded in this way. 13 infants without candles or sponsors, without godparents, without names. Judith was the only midwife in Dovewell licensed by both county and church. She had trained under a Quaker practitioner in Pennsylvania before arriving in Virginia with a trunk of linens and her own leather birthing stool. For a time, she was respected, known for her calm manner, her success with breech births, her refusal to let mothers die screaming. Then the quiet deliveries began. Not in homes, not in barns, but somewhere outside town. She never returned from the last one. There was no body, no burial. Just a final note in the parish ledger. Summoned evening of October 17th by private request, South Trail. The writing after that line is different, smaller, hesitant. The kind of shift that comes when someone finishes another person's sentence. The trail south led to the edge of Marrow land. Old town records show no formal contract between Judith and the Marrow family. Yet witnesses remembered seeing her walking that direction at dusk more than once, always carrying her black bag. No one thought it odd until she disappeared. They said the fog was thick that night. Said the forest swallowed sound differently when you went too close to the Marrow boundary. Her rented cottage was searched a week later. Nothing missing. The firewood stacked, the linens folded. But in her ledger, separate from the parishes, was something strange. Where names should have been, only numbers were written. Infant I, infant II, and so on. Each paired with a single herb, sage, rue, foxglove, the last, iris. Beneath infant Thurn was the word still, and next to it, in a different hand, the first appearance of the symbol that would haunt the records to come, a circle, clean and perfect, broken by a single downward stroke through its middle. The parish did not investigate. The church said nothing. The constable retired quietly that winter, but the ledgers remember. Her signature stops that same week. In later documents, whenever her name might have been referenced, only that symbol appears. It marked deliveries, it marked parcels, and in one case it marked a grave, an unblessed stone at the far edge of the churchyard where no flowers grow. Local lore called it the midwife's stone. Children dared each other to touch it. Mothers whispered to keep their newborns away from the Marrow path during winter months. They said Judith never screamed when she went missing because she'd already been silenced. The town clerk who filed her disappearance left no cause of death, only a remark in the margin. Presumed wandered, known to walk with purpose. But purpose to where? And for whom? She was last seen with her hair plaited down her back, wearing a shawl too thin for the season, her black bag swinging, her shoes coated in garden dirt. No one saw her step beyond the woods. But they heard something that night. A long, low cry they said didn't belong to a mother or a child. A sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground. After that, the symbol took root. It began to appear in places no one expected. On tools, on garden stones, etched faintly into the underside of a servant's water basin, always hidden, always waiting to be found by the wrong person. The last recorded sighting of Judith Ellsworth was not in the woods at all, but in a memory written down by a child servant at the estate years later. She claimed she saw a woman in the conservatory kneeling beside the herbs with her hand pressed to the dirt. Said the woman turned just enough for her to see that her mouth had been sewn shut with hair. The journal was never published. But the signature beneath the child's recollection matched Judith's exactly. Dr. Luther Marrow arrived in Dovewell in 1824, a man of precise speech and distant manners. He purchased the southern tract by the river, 12 acres of cleared land, an abandoned mill, and the bones of an old Quaker manor that he would later expand into the estate that bore his name. He came alone at first, though within the year he returned from Richmond with a wife, Elise, and a set of imported seeds wrapped in muslin and wax paper. People noticed he never raised his voice, that he always wore gloves, that he kept dried flowers pinned inside his overcoat even in summer. They called him peculiar but polite. He lectured occasionally at the university in Lexington on plant physiology. Sedatives derived from natural alkaloids, the respiratory effects of dried tinctures. His work was well received, even admired. Doctors wrote to him. Pharmacists paid well for cuttings. He spoke at medical gatherings and herbal guilds, his papers cited by European scholars. Yet none of them ever visited his garden. The garden was built behind the house in tight quadrants, bordered by stone and copper piping. His workers, all mute or near mute, tended it with obsessive care, though no one saw where they came from or where they went. The herbs grew in spirals, not rows. Rue and hemlock beside motherwort, poppy beside child's breath. Nothing about the arrangement followed logic, yet the plants thrived unnaturally, off-season, out of soil type, indifferent to drought. He said nothing when asked. Elise Marrow was seen less often. She walked to church on rare Sundays, pale and slow, her hands folded over her belly even when she was not visibly with child. Whispers followed her about the way she stared too long at other people's infants, how she refused to touch any of them. Twice she collapsed in public, once in front of the apothecary, once during service. Both times she was carried back in silence by Marrow's private driver. She never returned the glances of other women, never joined the tea society, never spoke about children. But the townspeople noticed. 3 times a black cloth was hung discreetly in the conservatory window. No announcement, no mourning bell, no parish funeral. But those who lived close said they heard something at night. Soft wails followed by sudden silence, like a breath being held too long beneath water. Elise stopped walking after the 3rd cloth. She died on a Wednesday in March 1832. No cause was listed. The obituary read only, Elise Adora Marrow, beloved wife of Dr. Luther Marrow, returned to peace. She was 29. After that, the walls grew taller. Brick replaced hedgerow. Iron gates appeared where there had been none. The workers, now entirely unseen, began accepting large deliveries at dusk. Bales of linen, wooden crates filled with powdered lime, mortar, quicklime, water barrels, salted straw. No invoices, no receipts. The drivers were told to leave their wagons at the edge of the gate and take payment from a sealed envelope nailed to the tree nearby. No one protested. Marrow spoke even less in those years. He withdrew from public lectures, declined invitations, refused to renew his university tenure. Yet he was never accused of wrongdoing. His estate was immaculate, his taxes paid. His contributions to medical literature continued, papers on nerve reduction, postnatal calm, infant temperament regulation. But the terminology shifted. One paper referenced something called behavioral tincture memory. Another described infant cry response as aromatic residue. Few understood the implications, fewer dared ask. When questioned, rarely about his lack of heirs, he would offer a soft smile and say Elise's health had been fragile, but her spirit enduring. He never remarried, never sold the land. But he expanded the garden again in 1833. A new section. No one was permitted to see it. In 1835, a visitor from Philadelphia noted in her travel journal that she passed a southern estate in Dovewell with unusual herb spirals that smelled not of earth but of milk and steel. She mentioned seeing a girl through the conservatory glass, walking with what looked like string in her mouth. The journal was not discovered until 1964, and by then the soil had already been turned. They arrived without record, without family name, without parish entry. The orphan registry from 1830 lists only 2 sisters unclaimed sent south. Their birth dates were not written, their parents unnamed, their origin unknown. The only detail preserved is a line scrawled by the clerk, taken in by Dr. Marrow for guardianship, approved by county council. The ink had bled with damp, but the words remain legible. After that, the ledger goes quiet. The girls were first noticed by a neighbor, Mrs. Eliza Grafton, who lived on the edge of the Marrow boundary. She often collected herbs along the fence line and one evening near midsummer she swore she saw them standing in the garden close to the stone path. They wore white gowns that looked new, unstained by dirt, though their bare feet pressed into the soil as if they had been standing there for hours. Their hair was identical, parted down the middle and falling past their shoulders. At first she thought them dolls or mannequins placed in the garden for some experiment of Marrows, but then one of them turned her head slightly. That was when she saw the mouths, not stitched with thread or cord, but something darker. Their lips sealed by lengths of dried vine twisted tight and sunk into the skin, leaving ridged welts around their cheeks. Eliza said she could see the vines move faintly as if alive, pulsing in rhythm with the children's breath. Their eyes looked straight ahead, unblinking. Neither spoke, neither cried. The garden around them was silent too, as though even insects refused to sound. Eliza fled. She told no one at first, not even her husband, but the image burned her awake that night. She claimed she could still hear a faint rasping, as though the girls were trying to breathe through sealed mouths. By morning, she confessed what she had seen to a church matron. The matron urged her to report it to the parish council. She did. The next day, Eliza's infant daughter was dead. The physician called it colic, though the child had been healthy hours before. The body was rigid, her mouth lined with a strange green stain along the gums. Eliza collapsed with grief. The matron who had heard her confession refused to speak of it again. From that day, no one in town mentioned the twin wards at the Marrow estate aloud. But the records held shadows. A servant who once delivered milk recalled seeing 2 small beds in the upper rooms, each with sheets embroidered with plant motifs rather than initials. An herbalist in Richmond noted in her journal that Marrow had written requesting dried vine cuttings, suitable for binding tender mouths. Another, more chilling reference appeared in Nurse Agatha Vale's journal, an entry in late 1831 describing the silent pair, who were trained to breathe through the roots. The orphans' faces never appeared in town portraits. They never attended service. They were never schooled. Yet every so often someone reported catching sight of them in the conservatory, standing side by side in pale gowns, their hair perfectly matched, their lips unmoving. It is not known how long they lived at the estate. There are no burial records, no marriage contracts, no subsequent trace of them beyond those fleeting accounts. But whispers survived. Some said they were not true orphans at all, but children taken in to serve as vessels for Marrow's experiments in silence, living subjects who could carry the residue of muteness to be harvested or passed along. Others believed they were his punishment to Elise, reminders of the children she never bore, frozen in a state between life and display. In the parish records, beneath the blank entry for 1831, a faint symbol appears once again, the circle broken by a cross. Next to it, a single word in faded ink, daughters. Eliza Grafton never recovered. She stopped speaking of herbs, stopped collecting along the boundary. She died young, only 5 years later, her throat riddled with growths no physician could identify. The house she left behind fell to ruin, but the path from her garden to the edge of Marrow's estate still runs in a straight line, as if drawn with purpose. The floorboards beneath the conservatory gave a hollow sound when struck, not like rot or age, but emptiness. The discovery came by accident in 1937, when the estate briefly changed hands to a preservation society hoping to restore the crumbling manor. While stripping the floor for sanding, a worker's boot caught on a warped seam. The plank lifted with less resistance than expected, revealing a narrow hatch sealed by a corroded iron latch. Beneath it, a steep descent into cold air and unmoving dust. What they found had no mention in the original estate plans. A stairway, cut from limestone, curved into a small chamber no wider than a child's bedroom. The walls were lined in tiles, once a soft blue, now stained gray by time and seepage. The air smelled of lye and something older, more sour. There were no windows, no candles, but the ceiling sloped into a small domed center from which hung a rusted hook embedded in a copper ring. Along the walls were etchings, not scribbles, not decorations, clinical diagrams, each showing the limb of an infant in various stages of growth. One tile depicted a hand, fully open with a number beneath it. Another a jawbone, delicately labeled in Latin. The drawings were not artistic. They were anatomical, measured and deliberate. Beside each, a symbol had been carved into the tile, notations not found in any known medical text. A series of circles split by lines, variations that repeated in a pattern none could decipher. In the center stood a table, stone rectangular, waist height. Its surface was scarred with dozens of narrow grooves, all shallow, all parallel, as if made by thin blades dragged with method. Dried residue still lingered in the crevices, too faint to test, too old to lift. At one end of the table, a single indentation, an oval about the size of a newborn's head, had been worn smooth by use. No instruments remained at first glance, but when one of the restoration team pried open a small drawer embedded in the far wall, they found a tool wrapped in linen. A clamp, long and narrow, with double prongs that opened in a pinched crescent. Along its handle, a phrase etched in Latin, divisio per intentum. The meaning would be debated, but loosely translated it reads, separation by intention. County officials were notified, but the report was quietly redirected. The society disbanded within months, citing financial strain. The chamber was resealed and the estate shuttered again. But not before the sketches were copied. Not before photographs of the table were quietly archived under a mislabeled case. Marrow, plumbing inventory. Those who entered the room described a feeling not of death, but pause, as if something had been stopped mid-process and left waiting. The air did not move, but the light, even from lanterns, seemed to tremble along the walls. One archivist later admitted he dreamt of the grooves on the table forming words, though he could never remember what they said upon waking. The presence of infant diagrams, so many, so precise, suggested a methodology far beyond standard anatomy. This was not for instruction, it was for repetition, refinement. The drawings tracked minute variations, thickness of femur, width of clavicle, patterns of fontanelle closure. Marrow had studied not only the physical form, but how it responded to restraint, incision, and silence. No names were found, no records, only symbols. One tile bore a handprint, too small to be an adult's, too deliberate to be accidental. Embedded in the palm, a sigil made of concentric half-circles and a downward-pointing mark. This sigil later matched the faint impressions found on the underside of Judith Ellsworth's personal ledger. The room beneath the conservatory has never reopened. The current deed owners deny its existence, but satellite imagery from thermal scans in 2012 showed residual heat beneath the foundation, in the exact shape of the chamber, as though something below still retained warmth or memory. The entries in Nurse Agatha Vale's journal grew more fragmented after winter of 1831. Paragraphs began mid-sentence. Times were scratched out. Entire lines were overwritten with a second layer of ink, as if something beneath had to be buried twice. But in the gaps, in the unburned corners of her writing, the shape of a ritual emerges. One not born from superstition or old religion, but from quiet, clinical cruelty. Designed, recorded, repeated. She referred to it only once by name. The measured cry. It began with 7 infants, always newborns, no more than 3 days old. They were kept in a room with blackened windows, and no sound but the tick of a long case clock that hung above the door. Each child was placed beneath a separate bell jar, thick glass domes with copper bases and small perforated vents. Tinctures were applied to cloth and laid near the mouth, poppy for dullness, valerian for suppression, dried thorn apple for paralysis. Some were bound lightly, others were left free to thrash. Then the wait began. Agatha described how Marrow would sit in the corner unmoving, recording the duration of each infant's resistance. Their cries, sharp, ragged, or sudden, were not heard as pain, but as dada. The clock marked the passing. When one child fell silent, the next was watched more closely. The final infant to stop crying, whether by exhaustion, drug, or fear, was taken aside, not comforted, not fed, simply marked. That child was called the vessel. The first to go silent, often due to tincture overdose or shock, was taken immediately from the room and not seen again. That child was called the offering. Marrow kept no ledgers, but Agatha did. She charted them in the folds of her own medicinal records, tiny annotations that seemed harmless to those unaware. A simple V for vessel, an O for offering. She sketched their swaddles, not faces, not names, only the pattern of how they were wrapped. Each cloth bore a different herb motif: belladonna, foxglove, rue, sage, some marked twice, some burned at the edge. It was not a one-time ritual. It was repeated, seasonally, aligned with frost, bloom, and the summer turning. Always 7 infants, always the same room. Agatha once noted that Marrow never spoke during the rituals. He simply listened. She wrote, "He hears something I cannot," as though he waits for the cry that bends in the middle. In one entry, she confessed to holding her breath alongside the children, to see if she could match their silence. She lasted 18 seconds. A vessel lasted 53, but what haunted her most was not the sound of crying. It was the silence that followed. She described it as thick, weighted, as if the air itself had been changed. The bell jars were never washed. They were turned and reused, still streaked with the last child's breath. Agatha believed the jars retained something. She wrote, "The silence that remains inside them is not empty. It is shaped." In the final pages of her journal, just before her handwriting turns erratic, she hints at a breach, a deviation. One line reads, "I switched them. The firstborn was meant for the slab, but I marked her as vessel. Hid her among the garden rootlings. No names, no date, only a crude sketch of the iris bed behind the conservatory with a small mark beneath the largest stone. Scholars dismissed it as a delusion born of guilt. But when that same iris bed was excavated over a century later, the soil beneath was looser than the surrounding ground. A small linen wrap was recovered, aged and threadbare, embroidered with a foxglove bloom. No remains. But the cloth tested positive for opium traces and fetal skin oil. Agatha's notes ended that week. She was removed from Westbrook Asylum 6 months later, declared mentally unfit and unresponsive. But when the nurse changed her bedding, she found a scrap of paper tucked into the pillow seam. It read, "The offering still breathes beneath the frost." The wall was never part of the original plans. That much the restoration team could confirm. It stood behind the lowest hearth of the servants' wing, buried beneath decades of ash and rot. What appeared at first to be part of the foundation revealed itself, after one accidental blow with the chisel, to be something else. Something assembled with no mortar, no adhesive, no reason to hold. Just stone, dry-fitted so tightly it hummed when touched. They took it down with gloved hands. Stone by stone. Each piece had a smooth side inward, and on that surface faint markings etched by hand. Not letters, not measurements, symbols, herb shapes. Spiral notations. Some bore deep grooves like tally marks. Others were stained with something dark and long dried. Behind the wall were 13 cavities, each no larger than a bread box, each just deep enough to cradle something the size of a bundled infant. The cavities were not carved at random. They followed a pattern arcing in a crescent like the curve of the old conservatory's stained glass window. And above each slot, precisely aligned in the soil above ground, herbs had been planted. Still living, still thriving. Even after the roof had collapsed, even after sunlight barely touched that side of the estate. Sage, rue, belladonna, foxglove. Each repeated in a cycle of threes until the final space marked only by a single iris bloom. The cavities were empty, but the signs of occupancy were undeniable. Linen fibers clung to the stone edges. A child's tooth, blackened with age, was found embedded in a groove. One cavity held a sliver of porcelain, the match to the baby shoe uncovered a century earlier in the garden path. Another contained a copper pin bent into the shape of a broken circle. These were not burial slots, not graves. They were holding places, measured, intentional, silent. Investigators who uncovered the wall in 1965 reported a strange heat emanating from the stone just before it was breached, though no source of warmth could be located. One described a scent rising as the final cavity was opened. Not decay, but something medicinal, bitter, floral. He said it clung to his clothes for days. The arrangement of herbs matched those listed in Agatha Vale's coded journal. Each plant corresponded to a role, vessel, offering, watcher, echo. The plants above had been part of the ritual, planted not for beauty but to signal what had been taken below. A language written in root and bloom. When the final slot was cleared, something new was found. A parchment folded and sealed in beeswax pressed into the deepest point of the stone. It had survived intact. Inside was a single pressed iris, its petals faded to gray-purple, its stem still intact. Beneath it, written in tight, clean script, Judith. No surname, no date, just the name she had signed again and again in parish ledgers before vanishing from the world. The wall, once dismantled, refused to stay still. Several of the stones shifted overnight despite being placed in containment. Some bore condensation when no moisture was present. A team member assigned to catalog the etchings reported dreams of breathing dirt, of hands pushing outward from soil that did not give. The herb bed above was raised within weeks. The soil beneath it was burned and salted. But even now, nothing grows over the spot where the iris once stood. They tried to reseal the space, tried to close it as it had been found, but the new stones never fit right. The air inside never cooled again. The wall had not been built to keep something out. It had been built to hold something in. The letter was never meant to survive. It was found folded into the spine of an anatomy book sold at auction from the estate of Dr. Théodore Remillard, a French anatomist once expelled from the Paris Faculty of Medicine under unknown charges. It bore no formal letterhead, only the initials LM and a date, December 12, 1831. Written in careful, almost affectionate French, it opened not with pleasantries but a statement of belief. We have been told that the cry of an infant is merely need-made noise. I disagree. The cry is the first unshaped will, pure intention. If captured before language forms, it can be distilled, stabilized, transferred. Dr. Luther Marrow was not proposing a metaphor. He was outlining what he called the doctrine of quieting. The belief was simple in wording but staggering in implication. Certain infant temperaments, if observed and harvested early enough, contained a purity of emotional tone that could be extracted, stabilized through botanical suspension, and transferred into others. Quieting agitation, reshaping instinct, even reducing violent or compulsive behavior. but only if taken before the cry lost its sharpness. Marrow believed that temperament, what we now call affect or emotional baseline, was not just behavioral but material, something within the blood, within the nervous system before it calcified into will. He referenced infants labeled as vessels in earlier writings, noting their ability to withhold crying even when distressed. Describing this as a form of resonant submission, he theorized that such infants possessed an internal chemistry that ran smooth without resistance. To extract that chemistry, he outlined a process both botanical and surgical. The infant would be exposed to a complex pattern of sensory deprivation and measured stimuli over a 72-hour window, tinctures of valerian, poppy resin, belladonna, and foxglove administered in cycles. No light. No sound beyond the heartbeat. The goal was to isolate the natural rhythm of the infant's emotional response, then draw it out through induced perspiration, filtered through pressed linens, and captured into solution. He called the result tincture of temperament. Remillard's notes in the margin, though horrified in tone, confirmed that such a process had reportedly shown staggering results in a patient at a private institution in Lyon. A woman described as chronically violent had become docile after a single application. The nature of that application was not detailed, but the implication was clear. The ethical cost was not addressed. Marrow's focus was purity, of emotion, of silence, of obedience. He wrote, "The vessel is not only a subject, it becomes a container. What it cannot cry, it holds." One paragraph was underlined twice. Of 13 initial trials, one survived the full process. The silence was complete. No heartbeat registered for 6 minutes, yet the infant did not expire. She opened her eyes at the bell's final strike. "I believe we have found not just a vessel but a reservoir." There is no official record of what became of that child. But scattered references in Agatha Vale's journal describe a girl kept separately, never named, who stared without breath. She wrote, "The others cried. She hummed." The idea that emotion could be harvested like oil, stored and then imbibed, that an infant's response to pain or quiet could be liquefied into influence, is not found in any known psychological or medical doctrine of the time. Yet the phrasing in Marrow's letter and the botanical procedures referenced mirror his other verified writings on behavioral sedation. This was not a theory, this was a methodology. A later journal entry by Remillard, dated 1834, includes a single sentence in his native tongue. "Il a mis le silence dans une bouteille." He put silence in a bottle. The ledger was discovered decades after the apothecary had closed. Hidden behind a false panel in a drawer that had long warped shut, the book was thin and wrapped in oilskin. Most assumed it would contain old receipts or herbal recipes. But when the cover was peeled back, the first page bore no title, only a date: Autumn Trials, 1831. The handwriting, sharp and angular, matched known samples from Dr. Luther Marrow's published botanical research. The ledger was not written like a merchant's book. There were no columns for coin, no weights, no charges. Each page was devoted to a single subject, headed only by 2 initials: LSTHIN. Below each heading were short notations, measurements of sleep, reflex, pupil response. But more than anything, the entries fixated on sound. Initial cry 19 seconds, recovered at 41, mouth trembled at 26. Response to tincture of poppy plus rue. Silence after application, no arching, no retching, final note, silent. Entry after entry tracked the same. Reaction to stimulus, duration of silence, whether the cry returned or vanished altogether. There were no recorded names, no parental identities, only reactions. The language was flat, clinical, but the pattern became clearer with each page. This was not documentation of illness. It was assessment of yield. The children were not patients. They were trials, and the outcomes were categorized. Every entry concluded with one of 4 terms: silent, for those who ceased crying within the expected window and did not resume; screamer, for those who resisted tinctures and vocalized past the 40-second mark; angelic, for those who stopped immediately with breath but no visible distress; watcher, a rare designation for infants who stared outward but gave no vocal response at all. No cry, no whimper, only eye movement. None of the terms were medical. They were behavioral, spiritual perhaps, functional. The dosages were precise, measured in grains and drops mixed with herbal suspensions, foxglove to slow the pulse, valerian to dull the throat, thorn apple to numb the limbs. But what was most disturbing was that the tincture ratios changed depending on outcome. The silent received higher concentrations. The angelic were noted as unstable. The watchers, always rare, were marked with an asterisk and no further comment. The ledger never once referenced payment, not for the ingredients, not for the outcomes. The only notations of value were effectiveness, yield, and behavioral clearness. Marrow had reduced human response to a pattern of noise and stillness and sought to bottle the latter. But it was the final page that unsettled even those who had read everything before. Initials: NK, initial cry, none. Reaction to touch, none. Eyes open, no tracking. Tincture response, not applicable, administered full sequence, no change. Final note, unknown, may persist in vessel form. There was no outcome designation. No closing word like the others, just that last sentence underlined once in a different pen. May persist in vessel form. What did that mean? That the child had not reacted but had not died. That something had held within, unexpressed, unchanged, and unmeasured? Or worse, that this infant had absorbed the silence so fully it could no longer be parsed from it? The initials NK appeared nowhere else in the estate's record, but in the pressed soil near the iris bed, uncovered in later excavations, was a small brass button with the same initials scratched crudely on the underside. It had been tucked between layers of folded linen patterned with foxglove. The apothecary who hid the ledger never returned to work after Marrow's final visit in 1832. His home was found empty. No signs of struggle. The shop was closed within the week. But the ledger remained, buried behind false wood, sealed against time, waiting for someone to ask what a vessel becomes if it is never emptied. In August of 1974, after a summer of record drought, a sudden thunderstorm broke across Dovewell with a violence that flooded gutters, split trees, and turned dry earth to slush within hours. When the rain cleared and the estate groundskeeper returned to the long-abandoned Marrow property to assess damage, he noticed something impossible. A light, soft blue, flickering faintly beneath the stone path that ran from the conservatory to the herb beds. At first, he thought it a trick of water pooling beneath the slabs, refracting the late sun. But the glow persisted well past nightfall, even as the sky cleared. It pulsed slightly, like breath. When he stepped closer, the air shifted, not in temperature, but in pressure. The ground seemed to exhale. The local university was contacted, then the Historical Society, who dispatched a small team to document what they assumed would be a minor chemical reaction, perhaps phosphorus from decayed roots, some natural explanation tied to old fertilizer. But when the first stones were lifted, what they uncovered was neither root nor rot. Beneath the topsoil, in pockets where no larger plant could grow, were small, brittle bones. Dozens, each no longer than a finger, each smoothed by time, arranged in deliberate shapes, 2 sets of 6 bones stacked in parallel, then a separate cluster of 7 arranged in a crescent. The pattern repeated beneath the next few stones: 6, 7, 6, 7, not strewn, not buried, stacked, measured. The bones were too small to belong to adults, most too fragile to belong even to older children. Wrist bones, tiny femurs, ribs the length of a toothpick, carefully layered in shallow depressions lined with crushed herb matter, crumbled sage, hardened rue seeds, bits of dried belladonna root. There were no skulls, no spines, no pelvises, only the limbs. By the time the fifth slab was removed, the glow had faded. Instruments registered no chemical presence, no radiation. The soil, now disturbed, lost its charge. But the witnesses, archivists, students, one university botanist, reported symptoms that did not fade. Shortness of breath, bleeding gums, insomnia. One described hearing the faint sound of breathing behind her whenever she closed her eyes. Another reported recurring dreams of hands pressing up through damp soil, palms open but mouths sealed shut. The investigation halted abruptly. The Historical Society issued a formal statement. The phenomenon had been natural bioluminescence exacerbated by nutrient runoff. The bones, they claimed, were animal remains displaced by seasonal flooding. No academic paper was ever published. The stone path was reassembled. But one archivist quit, without notice. His wife later told a reporter that he came home after the dig and refused to enter the garden again. Said he could hear humming through the soles of his shoes when he walked near the flower beds. He burned his clothes in the backyard and buried his boots. The archivist left town 6 days later. In the years since, the site has remained closed to the public. Fences were quietly erected. No further excavation permitted. But rumors continued. Children dared each other to touch the stones. Locals said animals avoided the path. One groundskeeper working night shift in 1982 was found sitting at the edge of the conservatory wall at dawn, hands pressed flat to the soil, whispering a name no one recognized, Judith. No official cause was listed. He never returned to the job. Today the path is overgrown, but the stones remain cool even in summer. No moss clings to them. And during heavy storms, some claim the light still returns. Just briefly. A breath. A flicker. As if something beneath remembers the weight of silence laid atop it. And still waits. It was 1991 when the iris patch behind the Marrow Conservatory was finally excavated. Local officials had approved a limited dig to examine the rumored underground cistern mentioned in parish blueprints from 1833. But beneath the roots of the iris bed, still blooming despite soil depletion, they uncovered not brick, not pipe, but a linen-wrapped bundle pressed flat beneath a layer of crushed blue petals and bitterroot ash. Inside lay the body of an infant. There was no coffin, no stone, only a handmade wrap stitched with a foxglove motif and a thin sliver of wax-sealed parchment tied beneath the child's shoulder. The bones had partially fused, indicating an age of roughly 2 to 3 months. Most of the body had mineralized over time, making full analysis difficult. But it was the skull that caused silence to fall across the team. There were no ocular sockets. Where the eye cavities should have formed, the bone was solid, unbroken, rounded, as if molded that way. A condition not naturally occurring in any known disorder. Closer inspection revealed shallow ridges near the temples, signs of incisions made before full cranial hardening. Surgical marks, but not from modern tools. Smoother, more deliberate, the kind that suggested not treatment, but intention. Tissue remnants along the spinal joint showed anomalies as well. The vertebrae had tiny divots drilled near the upper cervical region, a place that in living infants would control breath rhythm, voice tension. Those who reviewed the findings quietly speculated, this had not been a defect. This had been a design. The linen was tested for DNA absorption. To the shock of the research team, it yielded 2 maternal matches. Both women had once been employed by the Marrow estate, both listed as domestic servants. Both vanished in 1831, both labeled lost after service to the estate in old municipal files, terminology used before official missing person records existed. But one of the matches carried a name long buried: Judith Ellsworth. The other mother's identity was only partially preserved, a first name smudged by mold, the last missing entirely from archival cross-referencing. Her blood marked the child, but history had erased her voice. For a time, the infant was labeled Subject 1 by forensic pathologists, but inside the wax-sealed parchment a name appeared, written twice, the same name penned in different hands. Iris, beneath it another word in faded ink. Vessel. The body was reburied days later per the state's historical preservation guidelines. No headstone, no epitaph. The patch above it was reseeded with wild grasses, not iris. But within weeks, the same flowers bloomed again. No one had planted them. The burial records do not include the name. They simply list the child as infant female, bone anomaly claimed by none. But the scientists who examined her skull never returned to the site. One deleted all images. Another suffered persistent nosebleeds for a year, beginning on the day of extraction. The third, a botanist brought in to study the herbs lining the grave, quietly published a paper 2 years later describing plant memory in soil exposed to prolonged vocal suppression. She never mentioned the Marrow estate, but in her acknowledgments, she thanked someone named Iris. There was no further explanation. The churchyard at Dovewell holds 217 marked graves from the early 19th century. Among them, soldiers, mill workers, farmers, mothers lost in childbirth, and dozens of children taken by fever and accident. But between the years 1830 and 1832, not a single infant burial is recorded. Not one headstone, not one blessing, not one name. Parish ledgers confirm births. 13 infants were delivered under the town's jurisdiction during those years, all attended by the same midwife, Judith Ellsworth. But none of those births are followed by christenings. None are followed by deaths. The pages fall silent. Locals claim there must have been a fire, a flood, some misfiling, but no such event is recorded. The paper remains intact. The ink stops deliberately. And everyone knows what stands at the edge of the page. The Marrow house still looms over the south trail, wrapped in vine and shadow. The herb paths still wind in perfect spirals, though no one tends them. The soil remains bitter, water-repellent, reluctant to seed, yet foxglove continues to bloom out of season. Rue returns even after burnings. Belladonna thrives where grass won't. And through it all, the stones stay cool. In 2003, a motion was raised during a town council meeting to construct a small memorial for the unnamed and unburied infants of the Marrow years. It was seconded by a visiting historical preservationist who offered to fund the marker personally. The vote never took place. The motion disappeared from the minutes before final approval. No one would say who struck it. That same week, 3 council members were treated for unexplained vertigo and visual disturbances. One described seeing a figure at the edge of the Marrow Garden at dusk, 2 small shapes in white, standing just beyond the iris bed. The town physician ruled it exhaustion. The preservationist left town within the month. Dovewell has never hosted a remembrance ceremony for those years. No bell has rung, no candlelit walk has passed the estate, and no family pommeau. Even those with bloodlines that trace directly to the servants of the house have acknowledged children lost or forgotten. But the silence endures. Property lines around the estate have been redrawn. Maps omit the herb path. Surveyors avoid the garden's eastern edge. Children are told not to walk the trail after rain. Elders, when asked, simply say, "There's nothing buried there." But the soil tells a different story. In recent years, gardeners have noted unusual resistance beneath certain plots. Not roots, resistance, like tension. As if the land itself remembers being stacked, packed, sealed. Some have claimed that digging too deep along the old stone line causes the tools to vibrate faintly. One man broke a spade on ground that should have been soft, said he felt the sound in his teeth. The town still flowers in spring, the church still rings its bells, but behind closed doors, families warn each other to never take clippings from the Marrow side, never plant anything with blue petals near the home, and never dig for old records, because the dead are not gone. They are simply unspoken, and Dovewell never held a funeral. In 1987, a little-known academic journal published a short paper titled Infant Affect Transfer and the Possibility of Temperament Transposition. It was dry, clinical, absent of any dramatic claims, but its language mirrored something that had not been spoken aloud since the last pages of Agatha Vale's journal. The author was listed as Dr. Lucas Marrow. In his introduction, Marrow proposed that infant behavior, particularly emotional reflexes exhibited prior to speech development, contained not just neurological data but transmissible behavioral profiles. He argued that with proper chemical suspension and controlled deprivation, it was theoretically possible to isolate and transfer core temperament markers between subjects. He referenced no clinical trials, only diagrams, charts. One segment described a double bell containment apparatus used to measure affect decay in response to silence. The symbols used to denote each test subject were not letters or numbers, but circles with vertical lines, variations nearly identical to those found on the wall beneath the servants' quarters at the Marrow estate. The paper included no bibliography, but two of the sketches were traced replicas of diagrams uncovered in the experiment room beneath the conservatory, long since sealed from public access. One was a rendering of an infant jaw in progressive silent stages. The other, a handprint, small and missing a thumb. The journal issue vanished within weeks. The paper was formally retracted under vague claims of methodological inconsistency. Dr. Marrow withdrew from public discourse, citing threats and undue scrutiny. But before the journal was scrubbed, a scanned copy had already circulated, quietly, among fringe behaviorists and alt-psychology forums. In one such thread, hosted anonymously in the early internet era, a user calling himself Herbalist Echo 32 referenced the doctrine from the Garden estate and offered to share full ritual instructions for vessel quieting in exchange for scanned images of antique herb pattern embroidery. Another user uploaded photographs of a stitched foxglove bloom. Within days, the forum shut down. Years later, in 2015, an unlisted video was posted to a private academic network. The title, Tincture Trials Behavioral Stillness in Early Development. The footage showed no people. Only a table, a bell jar, a cloth bundle with initials stitched in red. The jar fogged slightly. There was no sound. At the end, a phrase appeared in white text against black. "We can inherit silence." The IP address was traced to a university in Virginia. That server burned in an electrical fire 3 days later. There is no direct proof that Dr. Lucas Marrow was related to Luther Marrow. No genealogical record links them. But the handwriting in Lucas's early notebooks held in a private collection bears eerie similarity to the ledger found at the Dovewell Apothecary. In 2021, an independent researcher digitizing Agatha Vale's Journal for Historical Preservation found a sealed envelope hidden in the lining of the back cover, protected in beeswax, intact despite age. Inside a single page, her final entry, written with trembling strokes but no less deliberate. "If they glow again, run." Today the Marrow estate is flattened, the garden razed, The conservatories remains bulldozed under state order. But every few years, especially after hard rain, residents report strange lights beneath the soil where the path once ran. Not fireflies, not swamp gas, something slower, blue, rhythmic. A local child once said it best while tugging at his mother's coat near the southern trail. "Mama, the dirt's breathing." She didn't take him back. The Marrow doctrine was never proven. But its language, its quiet methods still drift beneath modern theory. In rare labs, in dark forums, in fringe seminars that don't list guest speakers because evil doesn't shout. It whispers, it studies, it waits. And when it comes, it may not even wear a face. What do you think? Could this happen again?